Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for another devlog for Dauphin. It's certainly been a while since you've heard from me, so I appreciate your patience over the past few weeks, but it hasn't been without good reason. At the start of last month, we packed up and said goodbye to our lovely little apartment in the city and moved into our very first home. It's definitely bittersweet. That old apartment was freezing cold in the winter and brutally hot in the summer, and we found ourselves sharing some attic space with squirrels from time to time. But it was the birthplace of DevDuck and was just a really cozy space to both work from home, work on personal projects, and relax. This devlog marks the start of a new chapter for me. New home, new office, and even a few new friends in the aquarium, and I couldn't be more excited. Of course, one thing that hasn't changed in the last month is my to-do list for Dauphin. As you can imagine, I've been pretty busy with the house, but I did actually manage to make some changes to my sailboat artwork based on the great feedback from the comments of my last devlog and from my patrons. You may recall that we finished up the last devlog by allowing the player to pilot the research vessel on the open ocean, basically meaning you could accelerate and decelerate and also steer in all the directions. The only problem is I only have artwork for 4 of those cardinal directions, so it doesn't actually look very nice when the boat turns, and this is what I kind of got stuck on in the last episode. Because I've got so much detail on the paneling of the boat, it really was making it difficult for me not only to create the sprites you see here, but even think about creating diagonal sprites to help make this transition between directions look a bit smoother. A lot of y'all seem to agree with me in the comments that we did need those diagonal sprites to make turning the boat look a lot better. So my compromise was going to be to try to go into my boat artwork here and modify it to remove at least some of the paneling on the side of the boat and maybe on the cabin here, just to make this sprite easier to draw at those diagonal angles and ultimately remove some of those diagonal lines from all the paneling. Many hours of staring at pixel art later, this is our new research vessel. And if you're looking at this thinking, oh, he tried to make this easier on himself by removing paneling from the sides of the boat and the cabin, but he really just made it more difficult by adding sails, you'd be exactly correct. Despite the net gain of 0 trying to make this thing easier to draw, I really feel that a sailboat is a better fit for Dauphin. I think it fits the theme better to be reliant on the wind rather than some kind of motor, and I also just think it's really aesthetic. And I even had some people on Twitter suggest cool customizations like being able to change the color or the logo on your sail, which I think is awesome. So I ultimately ended up making this thing harder to draw in the 8 directions that I wanted and just grinding through it. And I'm really glad I did because I learned a whole lot about perspective here, and it was honestly a major accomplishment for me to be able to complete these sprites. So we'll go ahead and just jump through them real quick. This is now the sprite for the docked research vessel with the sails folded up and port side actually on the left, which I think is correct based on my very rudimentary understanding of boats. Now, of course, we'll step through to the east-facing boat, and then we'll start rotating counterclockwise here with the sprite facing to the northeast, the north, northwest, west, southwest, south, and southeast. So you can see we now have these kind of intermediate diagonal directions, which I've drawn to the best of my ability. I'm sure they still need tweaking, but overall, I'm super happy with how this looks. With all that artwork wrapped up, my next task will be to export it all from Sprite and import it into Godot, where I can hook it up with my existing systems for boarding and captaining the research vessel. It's just going on 8 o'clock here on Wednesday morning. I've just got an hour before work, so I'll do my best and catch up once I have some progress. Alright, back with a quick update here at 8:45, probably the last update of the morning before work, and I have managed to replace all the artwork for the docked version of the research vessel, which is what we're looking at here. This was a little bit more tricky than I anticipated because I had to redraw all of these colliders that you see here, and also I had to change some parameters for the transition to the interior of the research vessel. But that's all worked out now. We can go ahead and run the game. And we appear on our island, and you can see the docked sailboat here just off the sand. I think this looks so cool. I love the way it looks with the sails rolled up. But anyway, we can board this just as before. You can see the player kind of passes underneath the sail. Not a perfect perspective right now, but close enough, I think. And of course, we can still enter the sailboat and head to our navigation table to pull up the sea chart. All right, time to head off to work for the day. Great progress this morning, though. Next step should be hooking up the rest of that 8-directional artwork to the actual process of sailing itself, and then the fun part, designing the system that allows us to board the sailboat from an island, choose a new location on the sea chart, and then enter the open ocean and sail towards that destination. I'll catch up soon. Good morning, everyone. It is a cold and crisp Friday morning over here just after 6:30. Just grabbed a hot cup of coffee and I'm hoping to get about 2 hours of development time in before work this morning. But before I start, I wanted to give you guys a quick update. The first thing to note is that I've gone ahead and plugged my new sprites into my sailing scene here. So if we go ahead and get moving in the boat, you can see as we turn a full 360 degrees that we actually use 8 sprites instead of 4 now. And I think I need to work on the positioning of these sprites just a little bit, but overall I think this looks so much better and was definitely worth the effort of creating those extra sprites. So I'm really happy with that. As a side note, if you're wondering how I'm actually changing the sprites of the boat as it's traveling, I'm certainly not doing it manually. That would be a little bit of a pain. Instead, I'm taking advantage of the Godot animation tree node. And inside this animation tree, I am using a blend space 2D. What we're looking at here is basically just a graph with X and Y axes. And in my case, the values within this graph represent a normalized direction in which the boat is traveling. So for example, if the boat is traveling directly to the east, I'll pass in a vector with an X value of 1 and a Y value of 0 to signify that we are moving to the right. On that graph, that value maps to this particular point over here on the right side. And each of these points you see around the outside of the shape map to an individual animation. So this rightmost point here actually maps to the animation where the boat is traveling east. As you can see, I have 8 points around the edges of this shape to represent all 8 of my animations or directions in which the boat can travel. And to just give you a little demo here, we can switch to this little mode here on the toolbar and drag around this crosshair. And you can see that as I move around the graph, the boat itself is actually performing the rotations that I'd expect it to as it's traveling in the different directions. Alright, so after I finished up those animations, I started putting some thought into the system for setting sail from an island. And this is actually going to be really important. This is like the foundational glue that's going to allow us to explore the world of Dauphin. I'll start out with my general idea for what this process could look like, but I'd love to hear your feedback or just completely different ideas down in the comments, so please let me know. With that, we'll go ahead and jump onto the boat here and enter the cabin. And as you know, we can interact with the table here to pull up our sea chart. At this point, my thoughts are that the player can select an island that they've already been to, a new island that they haven't explored yet, or even just a random location on the map where they think there could be an island based on a clue they found in the world or a conversation with an NPC. When the player sets a waypoint in this way, my intent is to place some kind of arrow or indicator on the sailing scene to help the player guide the boat in the general direction of that waypoint, but more on that later. Now, I think it's important to note that I want interaction with this sea chart to be completely optional. If the player just wants to hop into the sailboat and aimlessly explore the open ocean, I want them to be able to do that. What that means is that we need a way to transition to that sailing scene without actually interacting with this piece of UI. So if I dismiss that and we head back to the exterior of the boat, you'll notice that next to our anchor here, I now have this sort of green cleat thing that's attaching it to the boat. My thought is that this will be a new interaction point that the player can interact with to actually transition to that sailing scene, regardless of whether or not they've chosen a waypoint from the sea chart. That interaction with the anchor is what I'm going to try to knock out this morning. Again, I'd love to hear your thoughts about all this down in the comments. In the meantime, I'm going to grab some coffee and go heads down and catch up once I have some progress. Welcome back everyone to Monday morning just after 7 a.m. I know we've managed to fast forward ourselves through an entire weekend here, but that's okay. I was hoping to get one more update out before my parents came into town for a quick visit of the new home, but unsurprisingly we just got totally tied up with projects and unpacking and all that stuff, so not a lot of time for dev, but that's alright. I do have one small update I can show you before we jump back in this morning. In my previous update last week, I finally set out to create the in-game transition for the player from exploring the island to actually sailing the open ocean, and I'm happy to say I managed to knock that out. So if we go ahead and board the research vessel here and head over towards the anchor, we'll have yet another interaction prompt, and I'll probably change this to be something other than the little screwdriver here. But for now, if we press the interaction key, we will see a similar dialogue to what we saw a few devlogs back. Do we want to haul up the anchor and set sail? If we choose yes, we'll also see a similar animation to what we had before, where it kind of zooms out from the player, gives a bigger view of the island we're leaving, and then it will perform a fading transition to the open ocean, at which point you have control over the sailboat and you can start to sail. The problem is, once you're on the open ocean, there's currently nowhere to sail, and that's kind of a big problem for this game. So for that, we'll start by heading over to the whiteboard. What I'm showing you here is not a very fleshed out idea, but I still wanted to show you how I was thinking about approaching this problem and hopefully get some feedback from those of you in the comments who have solved for this before. My basic dilemma is that I want to create a large world for the player to explore, but I want that world to be easy for me to initially create and to expand and to modify. If I build it all to scale in the game, it's going to be really hard for me to go back and individually change the placement of individual islands and add new islands, because it's just going to be a really big map. So my thought for how to solve that is to create a key tile map that is a very, very small, scaled down version of the world that will ultimately be rendered for the player to explore. Each individual tile in this key tile map will represent kind of a single sector in the ocean, and the type of tile that I choose to place in any individual square will represent what the player will encounter when they visit that sector of the ocean. For example, a very common type of tile will just be one that represents open ocean, but I'll also have tiles that represent certain islands, either handmade or randomly generated, perhaps dive spots or encounters with sea life, shipwrecks. Whatever type of content I want to add to the world for the player to explore, I can create a type of tile that represents that to add to the key tile map. Once I have a prototype key tile map in place, I'll have to create the world generator, which is really just a big parser that takes the key tile map as an input and as an output creates the world, which is going to be a scene with a much larger tile map that the engine will actually render for the player to explore. There's going to be a couple interesting problems to solve here, the first of which in my mind is loading. Because this is going to end up being a really big scene, I don't think we want to, or know if it'll even be possible, to just dump the entire thing into memory for the player to explore. Instead, what I think we'll want to do is lazily load chunks of that world as the player sails across it. I am not quite sure how I'm going to do that yet, but I'm very excited to find out. Alright, I think I've rambled on enough here. That's the basic idea. I'd love to hear what you guys think down in the comments. It is 8 o'clock now. I've got about an hour before work, so I'm going to get a refill of my coffee and jump straight into the key tile map. Hey folks, it's now Wednesday morning going on 7 a.m. I have a lot of work I want to knock out this morning, but over the past few days I have made considerable progress on the world generation system, so I figured it was time for a quick update. If we take a look back to my little roadmap on the whiteboard, you'll recall that my first step in this process was to create the world key tile map, and that's what we're looking at here. And this is basically a grid that represents the entire world that will be rendered in Dauphin. Now, I didn't end up using a tile map here because I needed each of these individual cells or markers to be able to be scriptable and contain their own data. And to my knowledge, I could not do that with individual tiles in a tile map. So really what we have here is just a scene that is a node containing a bunch of other node 2Ds arranged in a grid. Right now, I have each of these cells configured to represent a 1600 by 1600 pixel sector in the game. And right now, each of these cells is configurable to represent whatever data or scenes I want loaded into that particular sector. Right now, this world key just represents a world that is all open ocean, but we want to be able to quickly add islands to the world and change their position. So to do that, we can select a marker, say up here in the top left corner, and head over to the inspector where we can change the marker type from ocean to island, and then import a scene to load. And this is just going to be a resource path to the island that we've been working on over the past few devlogs. As you'll see, this square has turned green, and because we have a scene to load filled out for it, when the player actually visits that sector in the research vessel, that island should load and be viewable by the player. Finally, where this all gets glued together is the world scene, which as you can see looks pretty empty with the exception of the research vessel and the world key, which does have to be part of the scene tree so that my world generator script can actually look at it and decide how to parse it and lay out the world. My world generator script here is only about 100 lines long, and I'll probably go into more detail about it once I've cleaned it up a bit, but for now the gist is that it asynchronously builds the sectors of the world based on the current sector that the player is exploring in the research vessel. So if we go back to our 2D scene here and take a look at the key, you can imagine that if the player is exploring this green sector here, the world generator will only load that sector and the adjacent ones around the outside. And if the player decides to move to the sector to the right, these far left sectors that were previously loaded will be freed from memory, and some new sectors to the right will be loaded. So the only sectors that are ever in memory are the ones surrounding the player, just to be a little bit kinder to your machine and your resources. And as I mentioned before, all this work is being done on a separate thread, so that as you're sailing, you never hit any weird breakpoints or stutters or loading screens as the world around you is being dynamically built. Alright, with all the rambling out of the way, I think it's finally time for a demo. So what I'm going to do is hit play scene here on the world scene, which looks very empty in the editor, but once I do hit play, you'll see my asynchronous loading code in action as it goes all the way around the boat, loading the sectors that surround it. Once everything's loaded up, we can go ahead and use WASD to control the sailboat, at which point I'll start heading towards the southeast, which is where we laid out our first island, and hopefully after a moment or so of sailing, we'll find it. And here we are, right on time, and as you can see, it's basically the exact same island that we've been exploring as the player. Made a few changes to remove the camera that was part of that scene, as well as the docked research vessel. But apart from that, I was able to just instance it right into this scene as you would any other, which is just really cool. You can even see all the crabs walking around there. This is really awesome progress on the world generator, but there is still so much work to do. Right now the world knows where each of the individual islands should be, but the islands themselves don't know where they are in the world. So when you disembark from an island to go sailing, there's really no notion of where the research vessel should load into the world. And similarly, as you're sailing and you approach an island, there's no way to dock the vessel and begin exploring. So those are the things I'm going to work on next. And by next, I'm afraid that'll mean the next devlog, since we're just passing 17 minutes here. As always, I really hope you enjoyed the progress this week, and I'm super thankful for your support of this series. Special shout out to my Garami supporters over on Patreon: Cody, Fennec Fu, Mega Ombre, Vlad, James, and those who wish to remain anonymous. Thanks for sticking with me through this long devlog, and keep your eyes peeled for another episode next week. I'll see you then.